Hello, I'm Ian Skelly, and welcome to another episode of this season's new Wigmore Hall podcasts. This month, we're delighted to share a conversation with the musicologists Leah Broad and Natasha Loges and the mezzo-soprano Kitty Whately about the British composer and violist Rebecca Clarke. On Saturday the 8th of November, Wigmore Hall is devoting an entire day to Clarke's music, celebrating her important yet long overlooked contribution to British music making in the 20th century, and also marking the centenary of her major 1925 recital at the Hall. The focus day has been devised by Kitty Whately, along with the tenor Nicholas Phan and the pianist Anna Tilbrook. They've all just recorded Clarke's complete songs, and the album will be released the day before. On the day, they'll be joined by the soprano Eilish Tynan, the bass baritone Ashley Riches, and the violist Max Bailey, as well as Christopher Johnson, who worked closely with Rebecca Clarke in the last decade of her life. Together with Leah and Natasha, they'll present 4 events across the day at the Hall. Dr. Leah Broad is an award-winning writer, historian, and public speaker. Her first book, Quartet, is a group biography of 4 women composers, including Rebecca Clarke. Dr. Natasha Loges is Professor of Music History in Freiburg, where her research interests include song, concert culture, and gender and performance studies. She also worked at the Royal College of Music in London for many years, which was a college that meant a great deal to Rebecca Clarke. And Kitty Whately is a mezzo-soprano known for her interpretations of contemporary opera and of art song. Well, in today's episode, Leah, Kitty, and Natasha introduce Rebecca Clarke and her music, raising some interesting, broad musical questions about balancing composing with performing, about gender, and much, much more. So let me hand you over now to Natasha to begin.
So it might be helpful to our listeners to start just by telling them a little bit about who Rebecca Clarke was. And Leah, you're the obvious person to do this, having written the
Clarke
book.
Person. Rebecca Clarke is a composer and performer. She's a viola player, and that comes across in her viola works. She writes exquisitely for the viola, and many of her viola pieces are still sort of staples of the repertoire. But she shoots to fame in 1919 after writing a viola sonata, which she submits to a competition in the States where everything has to be submitted anonymously. And she comes joint first in this competition. The judges assume it might be by Ravel, and then they think it's a bit unfair, frankly, that he had entered. And then it turns out it's by a woman, and by a British woman who nobody had heard of really as a composer before this. She'd only written a few smaller pieces. And this allows her to kind of enter as a composer with a sense of credibility, which was not given to a lot of other women at the time who were seen as women first and as composers second. Rebecca Clarke doesn't, so we actually find that the early reception of this viola sonata is extremely positive. And that continues really throughout the 1920s, which is when she's writing most of her material.
I think going from 1919, when I think back, what does it take for somebody to be able to do what she did in 1919? And I'm not just thinking about the end of World War I, which was a huge turning point for British society, for European society, and all the rest of it. I'm thinking about the ingredients that go into a childhood and an education that allows someone like Clarke to end up playing the viola, her instrument, to that standard, and believing it was possible for her to write a piece like that sonata. So I was thinking about her childhood and her not uncomplicated relationship with her father. And I don't know if either of you want to jump in there and flesh that out, because there are complexities around this story,
Hugely.
aren't there? This isn't just a nice middle class, put an instrument in a child's hand and off she goes.
No, not remotely. I mean,
no, go on, Leah.
Okay. She was middle class. She was brought up as part of a middle class household, but she was forced to play the violin by her father, who was by all standards a really, I think, very difficult and borderline abusive man. He wanted a family string quartet, so he forced her and her siblings to practice their instruments. And, she writes in her memoir later in life about how she would be streaming tears, being forced to play this horrible instrument. She couldn't get a sound out of it. And her mother would just be like begging her to please practice. She despised it. There are no early signs of the extraordinary performer she would later become. Yeah, no, she had a very unpleasant childhood from her father's perspective, from the perspective of her relationship with her father. Very close with her mother, and particularly with her sister, Dora, when she's born eventually. But for all intents and purposes, she had a very fraught and fractious relationship with her father.
And I was also struck by the fact that she doesn't come from a musical family, because very often when you look at musicians' lives, there's a father or a brother or at least a cousin or an uncle, somebody who opens a door, generally a man, somebody who has influence and can introduce you to the codes of professional music making and the network. And so I think maybe this is a moment for us to dwell on the music institutions, the educational institutions that were available in Britain at the turn of the 20th century, which gave her an unparalleled network. Unless you see this differently, one of you. I mean, I think about what the Royal Academy of Music initially, and then particularly the Royal College of Music gave her, which half a century earlier she would have got through family. She would have got through a different kind of network, perhaps.
Am I right in saying she went to the academy as a sort of junior, what we would now call a junior, rather than the sort of age that people go to the academy now for a degree?
Well, so the academy, when it was set up, was different to how it is now. Right. So it was much more standard for people from a quite wide age range, actually, to be at the Royal Academy studying music. I'm in super two minds about this, because on the one hand, she has this incredible experience at the Royal Academy, which was famous at the time for turning out performers. So she was studying the violin and took that very seriously, because from the point where she gets from being this little child who is basically bullied by her father to practice the violin, to actually finding an emotional release through music and really loving the instrument. And so at the Royal Academy, I think she glimpses what a professional career might be. And she's one of this generation of young women who are starting to think about themselves possibly as having careers, as being able to one day have an independent income, and have a professional job. And I think that's what she starts to glimpse at the academy. But then she's basically sexually harassed by her teacher. And this is something that a lot of women encountered, was that their teachers would hit on them and see their students as basically fair game. And she wrote really movingly in her memoir about how horrible this experience was, because she'd known this teacher for a while. She thought of him as a family friend. She really trusted him. And then he asked her to marry him and kisses her. And she just says, this is horrific. And so it's a very divided experience for her. And then her father's so angry that he pulls her out of the academy, and that professional career that she's glimpsed sort of vanishes because of this teacher. But again, very complicated, because he always continued to hold a bit of a flame for her. He left her his violin, his viola later in life. But I think the Royal College was quite different. And Natasha, you've worked there, so you have a different perspective on the Royal College and what that was able to offer her as a professional.
Yeah. Again, just like you, Leah, I feel so ambivalent when I read this history, because it all depends on what you want to see. And to some extent, the college and her composition lessons with Stanford were hugely important for her. And she's very often labelled as his first female pupil. I think all of us in this room are a little bit wary of firsts and onlys, whether it's accurate or not, and also what that signifies. It's like, is that a good thing to be the first or the only? No, surely not. These institutions have been around for some time. But there is a sense that in that first decade of the 20th century, possibility was in the air. So it's not just that she has the composition lessons. It's not just that the viola, an unlikely instrument, is put in her hand with the excellent advice that Britain is going to need viola players. This is going to be a career for you. And how many of us would have benefited from such targeted and thoughtful advice at those points in our musical careers? Most of us just sort of bumble down the road and fall into what we're doing. So she had the right people saying the right things to her at the right time, allied with her own ferocious talent, can I say, without anyone jumping on me, a warm and open personality, a good personality for the business, a very clear head, a strategic thinker in terms of her own career. She seems to demonstrate astonishing maturity and astuteness
and confidence, I think, was
and
what I took
self-belief,
from
which I think is kind of part of the time. You see it in a lot of the women studying in those years, and a lot of British composers. There are two things going on here, aren't there? There's the nation enjoying its British musical renaissance. I know this is a contested term, but in sheer statistical from a statistical perspective, there's a lot of musical energy, isn't there, behind Britain at the time? That's something we might want to come back to later in this conversation. And the college, I think the other thing about the college, which is really very special, is that there are these orchestral classes going on bi-weekly. They cost a fortune. The council is complaining about the cost of them, but they are held onto. And that means that you have access as a young person to the inner workings of orchestral instruments, the dynamics of a rehearsal, how rehearsals, the feel of a rehearsal is something you learn. And she isn't barred from any of that. All of that is available to her.
And to be in amongst that sound world of an orchestra, I think. Not that she went and wrote much for orchestra, but I think as a composer, I always wonder how somebody could set about to compose something for a load of instruments that you don't play and that you don't know how they work. So I think to have been able to sit in amongst all that and take in so much music and so many different instruments and learn so much from that, as a composer as well as a player, I think must have been incredible. I think I'm right in saying that it was Stanford that suggested that she changed to viola from violin, not just because, as you said, the country was going to need viola players, but also because she would learn so much harmonically from sitting in the sort of middle of chords rather than always being on the tune, which is something that I found as a chorister. I was advised exactly that, to be an alto, so that I would learn. As a soprano, you're sort of you're just singing the tune the whole time, so it's very easy to pick it up. Whereas when you're on a harmonic line, it really improves your sight reading, but also your sense of harmony.
Music vertically when you're inside the texture. And I also feel now we have to do a shout out for Henry Wood, who is a little bit of a hero of the time. Maybe, Leah, you can tell our listeners why.
Well, before that, I think we need to credit Stanford there for, he really was training Rebecca Clarke as a serious composer. He was making sure that she had access to the best. He was one of the most sought after composition teachers in the UK, and she was one of his best pupils, and he treated her no differently to the men who he was training as well. And I think he really does push her, and we see that in her compositional development, where she goes from somebody who enjoys writing songs, but I think her early works, they need a guiding hand, right? She's starting out, and then by the time she leaves the college, she is writing these exquisitely self-assured works with a really clear sense of voice, and that I think is fantastic. And there are other guiding figures so while Rebecca Clarke's at the college, she has things come to a head with her father, and he throws her out of the house, and she is left completely homeless with only the money she has in her post office savings account, and he goes, "Get out of my house." And Rebecca Clarke has to find some way of, she's in the world, she's got to find a home, she's got to find a job. But I think this is what launches her as a professional musician, and she relies on her Royal College of Music network and contacts, and they rally around her, they support her. Stanford gets her, he doesn't tell her this, but he gets her an audition for a professional quartet. Parry hires her as a professional in the college orchestra, and then her desk mates from the college orchestra help her find a room. And then almost overnight, I think her father thought she'd come crawling back and go, "I'm so sorry, please let me come back." And then by the end of the week, she's a professional musician. So she really, I think this was the making of her, and it shows what a utterly determined woman she was, that when this happened, she doesn't crumble, she doesn't panic, she relies on people who she knows she can trust. And by that point, the Royal College of Music has given her the seeds of what will become her professional network. And And then, so she auditions for the Queen's Hall Orchestra. And so at the time, professional orchestras in London were barred to women. And it was just a male-only institution. And so Rebecca Clarke becomes one of the first 6 women in London to be hired into a professional orchestra, which is the Queen's Hall Orchestra, which is conducted by Henry Wood, who says, well, I'm going to hire the good musicians. And so as a result of that, he does hire women into his orchestra. And also we find that actually under Henry Wood's conducting years, there are quite a lot of women performers at the proms as well. And actually he wanted to commission an orchestral work from Rebecca Clarke. And she said, well, no, thank you. I'm a chamber musician. That is where I excel. I'm not interested in writing for orchestra. But I think he was really supportive of her, and it mattered a lot to have those.
He was a visionary. I mean, if you think in 1894, I think it was, someone argued that women couldn't play stringed instruments because they were missing a muscle. And you think, where do these ideas come from? And you only leap forward a decade, maybe a decade and a half, and then you have somebody who just says, well, I would like to hire the best musician.
Well, but bear in mind as well, though, Henry Wood was great, but he's hiring certain instruments. Yeah. So he's hiring string players. What you'll notice, he's not hiring women as horn players or as wind players. And there's still perceptions that certain instruments are off limits to women because of their physical capabilities or because it would make them look unattractive to play it. So horn, everyone's like, well, don't be stupid. You're not going to have the lung capacity as a little lady. Sit quietly and play the violin. And the violin actually, at the beginning of the 19th century, that was an instrument that was also off bounds to women because it was thought of as unseemly and a little bit too sexy. And the cello, absolutely not. Right?
Disfiguring the body.
Big wooden things between your legs. And it's only in sort of Rebecca Clarke's generation where the cello starts to be an even remotely acceptable instrument for women. And indeed, one of her best friends was a cellist. So yeah, it's complicated.
It's
the way
always a mixed picture. I think I just I grasp at straws sometimes when I come across powerful men of that generation who were willing to go some way towards addressing problems. I mean, there was no one who was prepared to. There is no such thing as being gender blind at that point.
No.
But he went some way, which I think must have taken some moral courage. But yes, you're absolutely right to point out her women peers who were really very brave and pushed ahead, allowed her perhaps to push ahead as a group. And I'm thinking really of the Muckle family, May Muckle, whose name we can see quite often on these beautiful Wigmore Hall programs, which are in front of me. May Muckle's sister, if I remember rightly, was a trumpet player. One of them was. There were quite a lot of Muckles.
Yeah, they were an extraordinary musical family. And I think did an awful lot to help Rebecca Clarke and sort of find her feet as a professional performer, because she has this example of May, who has been performing professionally since she was 9 years old. By the time Rebecca Clarke meets her and they're in their sort of late 20s, early 30s, she's an old hand, right? Yeah, she has been earning her own money from music for quite some time. And she writes her cello rhapsody for May. And I think it's just one example of the way she builds this connections around her. And she writes a lot of her music as a result for some of the most eminent performers of the day because they're her best friends. And she writes, Kitty will be able to speak to this much better than me as a performer, and you've sung so much of her music, but she seems to have a real intimacy in the way she writes for groups and the relationship between singer and pianist and within her ensembles. It feels very juicy. Am I imagining that?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be so interested to know if she sang herself, because all her songs sit so comfortably for me. I can only assume she must have been a mezzo herself. They're just so singable, and as you say, everything feels like an ensemble. Even just a song between singer and pianist, it really feels very much ensemble. The piano feels like a character. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with that, and it was wonderful delving into the songs for voice and violin, which we did for the album. There are so many, and I would love to imagine her writing them and singing them herself, which I'm sure she did, and playing at the same time. But yeah, I agree completely.
I think she has a terrific sense of melody, regardless of what she's writing for. The melodies stay with you. I think that's one of the most delightful aspects of preparing for this event and also for the event in November, that it's incredibly rewarding music. You don't feel like you have to listen to it because you have to know about it, but that you're making friends with this repertoire, that the lines feel very idiomatic. And perhaps one of the conversations we were having before we started this discussion was whether we can think of her as a musician who composes, whether the categories performer, composer would have meant to her what they mean to us 100 years later, when boundaries feel perhaps more rigid. And it might be provocative of me to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is that composers who actually have to get on the stage and play write better music. Am I allowed to say this? Because I just think there is a humanity and a consideration that goes into writing music when you know someone's got to stand there and do this. Their hands have got to get around those strings. Their breath has got to embrace those phrases. It's just cruel and unnecessary punishment to put 50 high notes one after the other. And also the joy of writing for an instrument. Her writing for piano, which is my instrument, I'm a terrible pianist, but still, it really embraces what the instrument is capable of. Pianists love playing arpeggios. She likes to write arpeggios, and there are things which only the piano can do, which I feel she embraces. It's as if there is a joyousness about writing for each one of those instruments' qualities, as well as the ways in which they interact and literally play with each other, which I find that really rewarding.
And I think this shows as well that she was great at relying on her friend network, because she plays the piano, but she's not one of the world's top performers, right? She plays it fine. You can tell with the viola, she is obviously writing with her performance hat on, like the opening of the viola sonata. That is such a statement of, like, for the viola, here I am. This is me as a performer. Yeah. You listen to recordings of that viola opening, everybody does it differently. It really gives you, in like 3 bars, this is this person's personality. This is who you're listening to, right? And I love that about the way she writes. It's so unapologetic and confident. And with the opening of The Seal Man, oh my God, the best song she ever wrote, that is piano opening. And one of her best friends was Myra Hess, who was one of the best performers of the 20th century on the piano. And she will turn to her and say, how does this work, right? And I think that's how she writes so idiomatically.
You can hear her writing what she would like to play herself, especially for violin. We were just talking about one of the songs, which is so virtuosic. It almost looks impossible to play. So I would have loved to hear her play that song with the violin. And
Which song's that?
It Was a Lover and His Lass.
From the arrangements of English folk songs, which are my personal favourite. I just feel that they've stayed with me. I haven't had to make an effort to find a place for them in my head. I just want to focus out for a moment and think about why the three of us are enthusing so much about the way she writes in the 1920s, and thinking about what other people are writing in the 1920s and what the general trends in art music composition are at the time, and how, as composers push more and more towards abstraction, towards the de-hierarchizing, is that a word? Of tones in a scale. I don't want to make this too technical, but many of us think in terms of what key is a piece of music in, and as the notion of key loses its power, music that she writes, it's positioning itself very carefully, precariously, perhaps even in the 1920s, where you have to show that you're progressive and you have to show that you're cutting edge. But at the same time, she, as a working musician, would have known the public also needs to enjoy what it's listening to and build a relationship with. I don't know if you have any, just thinking about you having invested all of that time, energy and thought into recording those songs. Do you think about her as writing in that style, in that decade? I just think writing like that in the 10s, 20s, and we'll talk about her later music perhaps a little bit later on. How do you place her within all of the music you've worked with?
She straddles that sort of changeover really perfectly for me and for my tastes. I started out doing the English song sort of rep that we're all brought up on, really tonal, pastoral, very English, which I still adore. And then, as things got, as time went on, the sort of, was it serialism they call it, the more abstract and difficult, frankly, to listen to and difficult to memorize and difficult to learn as an artist. It's off-putting, to be honest, and it's not my taste. But she developed harmonically in a way that I think it was so unique to her and so fascinating in a way where others might have been called cheesy or, old-fashioned. She took harmony in her own direction, and she gave it something that was so unmistakably her to me, without it being old-fashioned, without holding back. She went in a really interesting direction, and it feels perfect to me. It's the reason I think that I am so interested as I'm looking for a better word than pioneer, but like somebody who's interested in championing women composers. I think there's so much great work going on in championing living composers. But for me, I want to find the ones from history that should be in the canon already, that it makes no sense to me why they aren't. So that we are, before we start learning contemporary, difficult, esoteric, is that the right word, music, we start off with the simpler stuff, like Vaughan Williams and Gurney and Howells and all that kind of RCM gang. She should be in there. We should all know about her, and we didn't. Maybe I think students do now. I think things are getting better, but certainly it just never even occurred to me when I was at college, and I was so immersed in that musical language and that period, and happy to specialize in that. That was the direction that I was very happy for my career to go in, and that my first album was all English song. It just
were you ever taught music by women?
Never. It just never.
Did it ever occur to you? And I ask this because I had this similarly, where I grew up wanting to be a pianist, and so you do your Debussy, Brahms, etc. Did it ever did you ever question where are the women?
Never even noticed.
Why is that? Because I didn't either. And it was actually when I heard Rebecca Clarke's viola sonata, it wasn't until I hit university that there was a course on women composers, but it was an optional course and framed to me as, oh yeah, well, the music's not very good, but we got to kind of study it because it's important politically to know what women were doing. Yeah. And I went, well, screw that. I want to do good music and I want to be taken seriously as a thinker, so I ain't doing all of that. And then I heard Rebecca Clarke's viola sonata and I went, what the heck? This doesn't fit anything I've been told about women composing. And, I was told, well, women didn't have access to education, so that's why the music they wrote was bad. And then there's this extraordinary performer, and I think I just felt so angry afterwards when I went and
hit you.
Yeah, well, and then I come to recordings, and then I hear your recordings come out and all of this, and every time I do, it just blows my mind how brilliant she was as a composer. And I feel a sense of frustration on her behalf, and indeed on behalf of many women of this generation who were dismissed primarily because of their gender, who disappeared towards the later 20th century, even though they had extraordinary careers in their day. And it's incredibly frustrating.
That's the interesting thing for me about Clarke, is that she was so successful. What happened? Thankfully now she's coming back. But
can we just rewind to what she made happen, which I think that's where I struggle. I'm looking, having read and reread Leah's book, you see this extraordinary trajectory of success. She's working internationally. Her background is pretty international anyway. There's the German background, there's the US background, there's a British background, there's extraordinary network, playing in the best of halls. The music is coming out. And then there is at least a partial self-silencing. At least it's not that she stops altogether, but there is perhaps a stepping away. And I don't know if that is born, so I've speculated on this. Everything I'm about to say is pure speculation. So because I don't know. And maybe it is impossible to know what somebody thinks deep inside themselves when they make a decision to step away from composing in the face of what looks like an incredibly successful career, or slows down or whatever. Is it exhaustion? Is it a sense that the tides are turning and we think about what life must have been like in the 1930s? Certainly Germany for me is more familiar terrain. It was not fun being a woman at all in 1930s Germany, let alone a creative woman. I doubt it was so dissimilar in other places. So is there a sense that, that the ocean liner is slightly changing direction, and that the opportunities which had seemed so abundant and promising in the 10s and 20s are perhaps drying up, perhaps? So again, I'm speculating. Is there a sense that actually, you know what, I just really love playing and I love teaching and it's fine and I don't need to conquer this area? I'm thinking very much of Smythe, Ethel Smythe, when I talk about conquering, who's, Rebecca Clarke's older contemporary, who saw her entire musical life as a battle and paid heavy prices for fighting all the time. So do you have thoughts on why her relationship to composition shifts during her lifetime?
Yeah, absolutely. And before we did, so I think on the question of whether she thought of herself as a composer or whether she thought of herself as a performer who composed, I think probably she thought of herself as a performer and a composer jointly. And I think actually the fact that she's a composer is very important to her and that she does write music. She doesn't, I think that given the context where women are thought of as being biologically incapable of being creative genius, it's very important to her that she is a creator as well as a performer. And this is how she wrote about her own composition and how she felt about herself as a composer. And I just want to share it because I think it's such a beautiful sort of insight into her thinking.
When was this?
So this was in her memoir that she wrote towards the end of her life when she'd stepped back from composition, but she nonetheless wrote about it like this. She said, "When ideas did come, everything would fall into place with a suddenness almost like switching on an electric light. And when that happened, I had no illusions whatever about the value of my work. I was flooded with a wonderful feeling of potential power, a miracle that made anything seem possible." And that's how she thinks about herself and her work when she's writing, when she's fired up, when she's got an idea. And I think that is certainly the voice of somebody who thinks of themselves as a composer. But her relationship, the majority of her work that we know now was written in the 1920s when she was really at kind of her pinnacle as a composer. She doesn't write as much in the 1930s, but this is kind of unsurprising because she sets up a quartet called the English Ensemble, and she is touring all over the world. Her performance schedule is exhausting. When you look at how often she's playing, it's almost no wonder that she doesn't have as much time for composition. Yeah. And by the time she actually steps back from composing, that's in the late 1940s, early 1950s, she's 70. Right? Yeah. And so I think the person who I like to compare her to or think of her in the same bracket as is Sibelius, who also steps back from composing towards the end of his life. And that doesn't invalidate anything that he did before or make us think, oh, well, he didn't think of himself as a composer. I think both of them thought of themselves as composers who were due a retirement, frankly, and who had said, I think, Kitty, what you were saying about her style is so idiomatically her. And that style was very much in fashion, had a big audience in the 1920s. But when she moves to America in the 1940s, then, by the 1950s, she's got people like John Cage coming out. Music is going in really different directions to the direction of her voice. And I think it's important to her that her compositions are played, that they're heard. And she says, that was my voice and that's what I would want to write. And if there isn't an audience for it anymore, it's a lot of work. And she also talks about composition as being this all-consuming thing. And she sort of said, I don't have the energy to sit for days being consumed, torn apart by a musical idea that I have to get onto the page. I'm too tired. So I think it's a large combination of things. And also, she chooses not to marry in her earlier life. And I think she was a very beautiful woman, very attractive in many ways, I think. And she got lots of approaches from men. She had many opportunities to get married and she turns them all down. And I think part of that is because she watched so many women lose their careers after they married, had kids. And so she waits right into the 1940s when she's sort of moving towards the end of her career, and then she marries. And it's a real love match. Somebody who she met at the Royal College, actually, James Friskin, and he seems to be the nicest guy. Oh my God, I nearly fell in love with him secondhand reading his letters to her. He was so supportive. And he said to her, please write another viola sonata, write more. And she said, no, thank you. I've said what I want to say.
I want to pick up on something which you were saying earlier, because I was thinking about Wigmore Hall. And as I say, we have a sheaf of programs from the hall in front of us here in which she features repeatedly as a performer and as a composer. And of course, what that makes us, or what that forces us into, is chamber music and song, which I'm not suggesting is a bad thing, but it's an intriguing thing, because chamber music is complex, isn't it? On the one hand, it's really doable. The thing I love about chamber music is that it's pragmatic. You need a small number of people, you need a medium-sized space, off you go.
It's cheap.
Yeah, cheaper. Exactly. I can't, just if I were playing devil's advocate, I have to ask the question, I'm asking Leah really here, why did she not write for orchestra? And you might say she didn't feel like it, which would be a completely valid answer. But of course, one of the charges that is leveled against many women is that they don't tackle the big genres. And again, thinking about Smythe banging her head against the big genre wall her whole life with a large amount of success, but then not posthumous success, no sort of big legacy in posterity until relatively recently. Chamber music, also esoteric. Is that fair to say? Regarded as esoteric, or not so much in Britain at the time? Do we think of...
because we've got the radio.
Yes.
The radio sort of revolutionizes chamber listening, because what doesn't broadcast super well is large orchestras. Right. And so you get this boom in engagement with chamber music because it takes these small groups that broadcast really well compared to a large orchestra with the frankly quite sketchy and questionable early technologies for radio broadcast.
Yeah.
A trio is perfect, right? And so actually then when you can take these smaller groups and put them in people's homes, we find that actually there's a much larger audience for chamber music. So although it is viewed still as quite difficult music, often because the repertoire is quite challenging, and it's seen as sort of intellectually improving repertoire, shall we say. There's also a very wide listenership for it, and a lot of that is to do with the advent of the radio, and Rebecca Clarke is an early broadcast artist. So by the time we get to this big concert of hers in 1925 at the Wigmore Hall, which is exclusively her works, it's Rebecca Clarke of Wireless fame, where everybody's heard her performing on the radio. So as for why she didn't write a lot of orchestral music, I think this is for a number of reasons. One of which is she knows chamber music inside out, right? She is a chamber performer, and I think she likes to write music that she feels comfortable with, like that sits well for the instruments, and she knows
she would want to play herself.
Exactly. She knows how to write chamber music, and that she wrote not compositions as well, but words about chamber music, and really passionately loves this repertoire. And also, I think it's slightly pragmatic. She did watch older composers like Ethel Smythe, who writes 6 operas, and she does manage to get them all performed in her lifetime. But she has to stop short of nothing. She has to, put her life on hold to get these things. And, she might as well have committed murder, would have been easier than getting these blooming things on the stage. And she knew Smythe. She knew her as a predecessor. She knew her personally. Actually, Ethel Smythe came to this concert at the Wigmore Hall in 25 and was in the audience, and then invited Rebecca Clarke round for tea at her house on Christmas Day afterwards. Absolutely fell in love with her in her very Ethel Smythe way. And Rebecca Clarke said, she's a funny cracked old thing, but very nice, really. Which I think sums them up as two personalities. I think Rebecca Clarke, as you've previously said, she's strategic.
Yeah.
And she's thinking, if I write a big orchestral work, and I wonder whether as well she would have turned more towards ballet or opera, because she's such a rhythmically strong, hugely theatrical, right? Her gestures, the Seal Man is like a tiny opera. And when you think about the practicality of getting an opera staged, you have to convince the conductor, the artistic director, the opera house. You've got to come up with money. Why? Right? It becomes a question. Bear in mind as well, at the time, British opera is lackluster, to put it mildly. Ethel Smythe has to go abroad to get her operas premiered. And I think when Rebecca Clarke looks at that, she goes, okay, well, I've got to write in a genre that I'm 50% about anyway. Then I think about what it would take to get it performed. It's hideously impractical. I'm going to focus on, frankly, the more modern genres as well. Like chamber music was very exciting. It was cutting edge. And her style works really nicely, where you have these angular dissonances and quite violent sometimes in the trio. And that's really striking. And again, it's that theatricality. And when you think about how that looks on the stage, she was very, we're thinking about live music or its broadcast, that spikiness in her style works brilliantly, both visually live and recorded for broadcast. So I think she didn't write orchestral music because it didn't suit her as a composer. And I think that's why she was trained to do it and wasn't interested.
We wanted to touch also on her late works, which arguably underappreciated, not known well enough. I think there may be for those who are familiar with Clarke, there may be a perception that there's really a very short period in her life where she wrote music, and that's not quite the case, is it? Can we turn to the works from later in her composing life?
Yes, so the Passacaglia is a piece for viola and piano that she wrote in the 1940s during World War II, and it's inspired by, the theme is by Thomas Tallis. And I think this sense of Britishness, so in World War II, she gets stuck in America. And all her life, her career has been split between America and the UK, but her home has always been in Britain. And then she finds herself stuck in America, unable to come back to the UK. And so she spends World War II looking back and sort of finding out via the radio, finding out via newspapers what's going on in the UK. And I think that must have been a rather difficult and alienating experience for her.
Am I right in saying she was refused a visa because she was regarded as a non-essential person, which I think must have been so devastating. Saying, well, we don't need you. You hang out over there. And to be cut off, essentially, against her will in those years.
Exactly. And so while all of that is going on, she writes this Passacaglia on an Old English tune by Thomas Tallis. And it's a really simple theme. It's a set of theme and variations. But what she does with these variations is just extraordinary. There's this point where the viola comes out. It's basically a really formidably difficult concert rhapsody for the viola. And there are sort of echoes of Rachmaninoff in there, in some places. And I think this is her again thinking about what does it mean to her? What does Britain mean to her at this point? And for me, this is a piece that it isn't nostalgic in any way. It seems to be more kind of pushing forward and going, maybe this is what a reimagined Britain can look like. This is what we can emerge with in a kind of hopeful way rather than a nostalgic way. And so I adore this Passacaglia, and I'm really glad to see it programmed because it's, and bearing in mind when it was written as well, very tonal. It is very listenable. It is very attractive, I think, and quite powerfully moving as a piece.
Very poignant.
Extremely,
Yeah. Would it then be fair to say that the last 30 years of her life are spent in a really rewarding career of teaching and playing, and her happy late
she
marriage?
does lecture occasionally, but I think she enjoys being married to this really lovely bloke. And she enjoys seeing her family, and I think she enjoys the sort of being herself, being alive in a way that she's dedicated herself so single-mindedly to her career up until that point. And she mostly at that point steps back and says, this is
do you think the war had any effect on her in that respect?
Yeah, I do. And she, I think, reevaluates what's important. Given the stage of life that she's at. But also, she does think about her legacy as a composer as well. So she's going back, she's revising works. It's not that she's not writing, she's revising works. And then towards the end of her life, she starts cataloguing her music with her, let me get this right, it's great nephew by marriage. And she's thinking about the works that she does and doesn't want to put out. She was very careful about the image that she put out herself. She's very astute woman, and it's not like she's just gone, oh well, I was a composer, that's the end now. I think she's thinking about her legacy and who she is. And there's a wonderful, in the sort of 1970s, there's a performance of her viola sonata in America, and she's asked to write the program notes. And she said, well, there was speculation that I didn't exist as a composer when this piece was first performed. And I am going to take this moment to say I definitely do exist. So I think at the end of her life, she just got to see this moment where actually her music was being picked up again. At first, it was only the viola sonata. And actually the nonsense that gets published about her, just completely factually inaccurate, because so little was known about her at the end of her life. And that's quite extraordinary. And, you were saying earlier, Kitty, what happened to this woman who was so incredibly famous in the 20s. So there's a book called The Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, which then as now was considered kind of like a standard text, right? You want to know something about classical music, you go to Grove. Yeah. And in the 1920s edition, she has a full biography. She's got a list of works. It talks about her as a composer and as a performer. In the 1980 edition, it says Rebecca Clarke, viola player and composer C. James Frisket, who is her husband. Wow. So the editor had removed her entry.
It's very hard to get away from the fact that the 1950s to the 80s were an extraordinarily hostile time for creative women. And that's the case across the arts. I mean, in literature, women have always fared better.
Why did it go backwards then? Because in the 20s and 30s, it felt like things were getting better.
This is a great question. I'm not sure there's a straightforward answer, because sometimes I think, war, this is a dreadful thing to say, war is good for women and post-war is not good for women. Of course, war is not good for women. Even as I say those words, I think, God, what a stupid thing to say.
No, but that
war
seems the obvious
opens up
answer.
certain opportunities, but the post-World War I years were wonderful years for many women. In creative terms, the 20s were a very exciting decade. There is something about the 1950s which is something to do with economic structures and social structures, the rise of the suburbs, the rise of the car. I mean, there are so many things which seem totally irrelevant to the writing of music, but which shape our lives. And when we make music, we make them in the context of a lived life, which involves also perhaps taking a child to school or needing to get into London. London then, perhaps as now, being a very powerful cultural centre for the country, tendency to suck the life out of other places, perhaps. And I'm thinking of Clarke's younger contemporary McConkie when I say that when you leave London, you are cutting yourself off to a certain extent. Perhaps that's something that was exacerbated by the rise of suburbia in World War II, after World War II, which did not happen after World War I. So I think this is one of those really fascinating historical questions. I mean, this is also about masculinity and
you can imagine the men coming back and reasserting their authority, and I think of the 50s as that sort of Stepford wife era. When you think of women in that era, my image is that sort of perfect wife image, and I guess they must have been a pressure to.
And there were also lots of women who chose that.
Well, so this is the thing, like World War II and World War I are really different wars, right? Because World War I, there's a sense of this is the war to end all wars. we're in a sort of period of this was horrific, but now we're going to look to the future with optimism.
Yeah.
And for women in Britain as well, this coincides with getting the vote. Women are kind of in fashion in 1919. And as well, it really was the first time that real opportunities have been opened up for women in terms of saying, no, actually, we just need nurses. You're going to have to get over the fact that women are going to see naked men. We just need nurses. But by World War II, there's a sense of real weariness of like, actually, that wasn't the war to end all wars. This war is a horrific ideological battle in some senses. And by the end of World War II, I think a lot of women do choose to go back. There's a huge pronatalist push because the birth rate has tanked mid-World War II. And, you know, hundreds of thousands of people died. And so there's a huge push to get women back in the home, to be having kids. And because of what happened after World War I, where soldiers came back and went, I'd like my job back, please. By the time you hit World War II, there's almost a sense that like, oh, we know that we're giving these women these jobs on a temporary basis. And when the men return, they're going to give it up.
Yeah.
And so actually there's a huge conservative backswing in the 1950s and late 1940s where you've got rationing as well, lasting for quite a long time in Britain. It doesn't just disappear with the end of the war. And you do find that then as well, musically, you've got the rise of modernism, serialism, really atonality's taken hold by this point, and the institutionalization of music means that there are more gatekeepers for women to try and push past. That in the 1920s, things were a bit more eclectic. There weren't these big honking institutions like the BBC that have so much power that post-World War II, the BBC became like the British thing, right? You tuned in to find out the news, you listen to the BBC. You want to have a career as a composer post-World War II, you've got to be on the BBC or you're going nowhere. And all of those factors sort of pull together, plus the fact that sort of serialism and atonality, particularly serialism, are thought of as manly and masculine and a man's game. They really push women out, even women like Elizabeth Lutyens, who was a sort of pioneering serialist before anybody else was doing it in the UK. And it's coded male. And then the sort of generation of women like Elizabeth McConkie and Grace Williams, whose music sits just on the edge of tonality, but not quite going there. They're, you know, they're sort of at the top of the pile of people who are accepted. And even for them, the 1950s are really miserable years in terms of performances. It's a remarkable dip after World War II. And this is something that people who come up to me who've read the book and they say, like, I can't believe how bad things were for women. And it actually takes us until 2019 to have the same number of women composers programmed at the proms as there were in 1919 because the 1950s and 60s are so bad.
I mean, this comes back to your important point about this kind of work as an act of recovery. We always assume we're progressing and we always assume things are getting better, but there's this sense of ebb and flow for a figure like Rebecca Clarke, who lives a long life, you know, think of being born in the 1880s, dying in the 1970s. That's a lot of change to witness. And I would love to know, I would love to have had huge volumes of collected letters and the kinds of things that, you know, historians delight, where you can actually look into somebody's mind and see how they experience those ebbs and flows. But I don't blame her for making the decisions that she made. She seems to have made them with a spirit of joy and with a sense of agency.
That was the impression that I got, certainly from your book. I felt that. And I, as I was saying to you earlier, as I get older, I can understand how that could be a thing. She's so different to Smythe, isn't she? And that Smythe just never gave up the battle. Whereas I really got the impression that Clarke relaxed into her role of wife and teacher and enjoyed her life and wasn't battling to the end. And I would hope that as a performer, you know, I feel like my whole life has been battling to work and to get work, and I don't want to do that forever. I will.
Oh, don't say that.
No, I don't want to battle. You know, I would love to sing forever, but I don't want to be at war forever. I don't want to be constantly asking for work. And I can imagine getting to a point of
she
just
did
being
live 10 lifetimes, didn't she? I mean, in her musically active decades, as you pointed out, her schedule was jaw-dropping.
And I really hope that her memoir and indeed her correspondence and her engagement diary do get published. And her great nephew Chris, who's going to be at this day on the 8th, which is, I think he has such wonderful memories of Rebecca. So it's going to be amazing to get to hear him speak about her. But he's got this material, you know, I think it really should be published. And I really hope that does happen, because it just gives us this insight into this woman. And this is something that is so important for making women normal, so we don't have to talk about them as women but as composers, is having the resources to know who they were and to be able to study them, right? Because you have all these collected editions of letters by somebody else who I'm writing about at the minute is Grieg, right? I can go and read his diary. I can go and read his letters. With Rebecca Clarke, I had to beg Chris to go, please can you send me this thing? And he was fantastic, right? He sent it all to me, everything I asked for. But it's not published. You can't just go to a library and access that. And that's so frustrating because it happens over and over and over again with women in particular. And Rebecca Clarke actually is surprisingly accessible because so much of her work was published now, you know, with sort of finishing up recording her works, but it's all out there.
It was a tie for us though. I mean, we were torn about it, is what I mean, because we felt slightly uncomfortable about recording songs that she herself didn't want published. She wasn't mad about them.
Early stuff.
Yeah, we've recorded everything.
Settings,
and songs that she wrote when she was still a student, and you know, by the standards of her later works, they're not world-changing songs. But I think the act of cataloguing them and putting out something that, as you say, gives her what we give to all the canon guys, which is a history and a comparison and a look at how her voice developed. I think there's such a pressure on women composers to be perfect, and if you put out a song that's less than perfect, then she's somehow going to damage the reputation of all women composers. And so it was a difficult decision for us to put those songs on the album and to call it a complete works. And even one of them, actually, we're starting the whole day at Wigmore with one of her earliest songs. And I felt, is that a risk? Is that something that I really want to start the day off with, something that's less than her best? But I do think it's so important and so interesting to see how she progressed and to treat her the way that we treat all the greats, which is to study everything they did and to
thank
put them
you
under
for
a
saying
microscope.
that, because oh my god, the pressure for women composers to never write a dud note is real. And you know, you just, as you say, we don't extend that. I'm thinking, you know, I've got the Sibelius edition, every single note he ever wrote, and some of them are good, some of them are not. And it's okay for women are just people too, to sometimes write work that isn't good. And especially the works you're talking about, these are some of the first things she ever writes. I think it's so important that we can get a sense of, you know, I think there are two reasons for recording things. One is for listeners to go, oh, this is a fantastic piece of music, but also in terms of, as you say, like putting this woman into context, and thinking about it from a writer and a sort of academic perspective, to watch her develop. That tells us so much about her as a creative entity, and also the like different influences she's absorbing at the time. So I'm really glad that you included them, even though it is hard, especially when composers are very self-limiting sometimes, or you know, they're very aware of the fact they don't want to put out something that they don't consider their best, and it's a hard choice to say, but I think we need to hear it anyway.
I do think that many of our listeners, I'm hoping, will be passionate advocates of song in particular. And there are very few people who would say that the songs that Robert Schumann wrote in the late 1820s or Brahms in the early 1850s, or indeed any of them, and I'm thinking of somebody, I say this as somebody who spent a lot of time with this music, everybody starts somewhere. And we listen to those early pieces so that we can see someone grow, we can see someone change, and we can get to know them in a multivalent way, as opposed to just the showstoppers. We love the showstoppers. I will listen to Sealman any time of day, but we want these people to be three-dimensional within our cultural lives.
I'm struck by how much different pieces of hers speak to different people, right? Different listeners will sometimes, so for me, the Seal Man is like one of my number one pieces, and I find the Shy one of her first published song is like it's okay.
I hear you.
I don't like the poem. So.
Well, I just think it's a bit naff, honestly, sometimes. But, she's thinking commercially, fine, fair enough. But actually, when I've taught that piece, some of my students loved it, and they felt that the Steelman was a bit overwrought, a bit too much. And I just love the range as well, particularly in her songs.
Yeah.
That they're all very distinctively her, but they cover a lot of range of emotion. And I like that she's got something for everybody there. And so even the stuff that I don't think of as my favorites, I'm really glad it's still getting out there because it might be somebody else's favorite.
Mm-hmm.
What was in your mind when you put this day together? What do you want to achieve with it?
Well, I'm firstly thrilled that it's going to be a whole day. I first approached John Gilhooly and the Wigmore to do an evening. I would have loved to just done a concert of Rebecca Clarke's music to celebrate the launch of our CD. But it was John's idea to actually, let's do a whole day, a whole focus day, lecture recitals, lunchtime concerts, and a big evening celebration, which was so much more than I could have anticipated. And it means that we've been able to present so much more of our repertoire. We could have done 2 days easily. There's so much to celebrate. So it's been painful actually cutting it down even to an entire day. But for me, I just want the world to see that actually this is a composer who should be up there with the core canon composers that we all love. This music needs to be heard. Singers, I want you to sing other songs other than The Steelman. The Steelman is one of the best English songs ever written, as far as I'm concerned. Certainly, I think it's her best song. But she also wrote hundreds of wonderful songs, and I want to hear more of her songs performed. And I just want her to be a household name in the way that Vaughan Williams and Gurney and Howells and all that gang are. She's in that gang. She was in there. She studied with them. She was shoulder to shoulder with them, and I think she should be still.
Thank you to Leah Broad, Natasha Loges and Kitty Whately for that fascinating conversation. If you'd like to learn more about Clarke and her music, do listen to the new recording of her complete songs with Kitty Whately, Nicholas Phan and Anna Tilbrook, which is released on Signum Records on the 7th of November. Or why not come along to Wigmore Hall the following day, on Saturday the 8th of November, to enjoy one or more of the 4 events we have planned throughout the day, celebrating Rebecca Clarke's remarkable life and music.